Rewards and forwards. Dialogos smiled at his young friend as he paced up and down in front of him, his hands waving animatedly as he talked. What it was to be young and energetic, he thought to himself. They rarely saw eye to eye, but he relished these conversations. They kept him young. They both had such different views of the world, but shared the same passions. It was fun to thrash out ideas. Vice is contagious. That is an established fact. Haravgi was in his element now, always confident on matters of philosophy like this. That means, if we allow the Imperial Senate to access these funds, they will be corrupted by it. The vice will consume them like a fire, till all that is left is a house of cowards and thieves. The only way to check that is to ensure virtuous dispensation of the proceeds. I hope you're not going to make an argument based on hypothecation. Dialgolos winced in mock pain. It's a question of axiology. It's about fundamental values. Putting the money in the hands of the synod gives it a completely different meaning, said Haravgi. Axiology? I think you've got a stronger argument pointing out that the status quo encourages the Senate to maximise the amount of crime committed. Either way, you're not going to move the Imperial Senate with this. Trust me. I've thought of that. Haravgi grinned, clearly pleased to have an opportunity to reveal his master plan. Overview. At the autumn equinox, Cassia Silkweaver raised a judgment in the Urizen National Assembly that explicitly thanks the Varushkan boyars for their aid in providing an imperial wayleave to support the construction of the Gardens of Pallas. Such statements are not uncommon in the national assemblies, where the priests wish to put acts of generosity and prosperity by citizens of other nations on record. In theory, the Imperial Synod already possesses the means to thank a nation for virtuous acts, like the gifts of the boyars, but in practice the Virtue Fund rarely has the means to provide meaningful restitution on this scale. Even with the proceeds of the sale of the Imperial Liao, the fund has only a tiny fraction of the money at its disposal that the Imperial Senate has from the Treasury. Inspired by Cassia Silkweaver's statements, 2 Urizeni priests, the semi-retired architect Dialgolos of the Isles of Spires, and Haravgi, a young questor of no fixed abode, have a pair of proposals they think may help. Their aim is to significantly boost the funds available to the Virtue Fund on a permanent basis, thereby empowering the Imperial Synod to actively reward those who are judged to have acted virtuously. Prosperity and posterity. Dialgolos proposes the construction of prosperous counting houses in each territory in the Empire to gather the donations to the Virtue Fund and keep a record for posterity. Dialgolos has a simple, if expensive, solution to the problem. He has created a design for what he calls a prosperous counting house, a small stone building to be constructed somewhere relatively safe in each territory of the Empire, potentially. The counting house need not be large. They would require just 5 wains of white granite and 5 wains of weirwood and 30 crowns to build, and could be completed in a single season. Each counting house would provide a convenient location where Imperial citizens might make a donation to the Virtue Fund and have their names recorded in an official ledger. While the inherent virtue of the proposal appeals to Dialgolos, the old architect is keenly aware that the ultimate goal is to ensure that the Virtue Fund has enough money to reward its citizens appropriately. A counting house in Sermasuak is a virtuous thing to do, but it's unlikely to receive the same donations as a counting house built in the city of Sarvos, simply because there are so many more wealthy merchants living there. To that end, he has devoted considerable time identifying the 10 most effective territories in the Empire in which to build a counting house. In each of these territories identified by Dialgolos, a counting house would result in significant donations to the Virtue Fund, boosting income by at least 10 crowns each season. Those built in especially wealthy locations like the city of Sarvos would produce comfortably more. Individually, these are small amounts, but if enough counting houses were built, then the Virtue Fund would soon find itself the recipient of a considerable income. The 10 most profitable territories, from greatest to smallest, are as follows: Tasato, Holberg, Sarvos, Temeshwar, Segura, Skarsind, Karsk, Mitwold, Miaren, Harnmark, Semaholm, Rykos, Zenith. Fines and funds. Haravgi proposes that the Imperial Senate pass a motion instructing the magistrates to pass all fines collected to the Virtue Fund. Haravgi suggests that the virtuous across the Empire persuade the Imperial Senate to pursue this course of action by withdrawing their labour. Haravgi has a rather different proposal, one which might prove somewhat more controversial. Having given the issue some thought, the young questor has hit on the novel idea that those who dabble in vice should be made to support the virtue fund. In that way, vice becomes expensive while virtue is rewarded. Of course, there is no legal mechanism to compel those who lack virtue to hand their money over. Indeed, any proposal of that kind is unlikely to be compatible with the Constitution. However, Haravgi points out that the unvirtuous are already handing their money over, or at least some of them are, those who are fined by imperial magistrates for any crime they are found guilty of and not executed for. In pursuit of this idea, Haravgi spent time chasing the civil service to find out exactly what happens to the fines collected by the imperial magistrates. It soon became clear that the money was being spent by the magistrates to fund the efforts of law enforcement to identify and catch criminals. It took a lot more work to identify that this was based on tradition, extending all the way back to the time of Empress Diane. In fact, there was no legal basis for the practice. Eventually, Gerard Lassalle was forced to accept that this money should in fact be added to the imperial treasury, and confirmed that henceforth that this is what would happen. Having achieved precisely half of what he wanted, Haravgi then obtained a ruling from the Constitutional Court confirming that the Senate could pass a law indicating that all fines collected should be passed to the Virtue Fund. Haravgi has it in writing that such a motion would not violate the constitutional prohibition on taxation. All he needs to complete his novel idea is to persuade the Imperial Senate to give up the money that they have just gained and pass it to the Synod. Haravgi's critics have pointed out how unlikely that is to happen. The Empire is always short of money. The Imperial Senate has more money than any individual citizen could dream of, and yet there still never seems to be enough. Given the regular friction between them and the Imperial Synod, why would they pass the fines to the Imperial Synod? Haravgi's philosophical arguments about how the money from the fines is tainted and needs to be in the virtuous hands of the Synod to wash the coins clean are unlikely to build any spires, according to Dialgolos. Undeterred, Haravgi suggests that if the virtuous arguments will not carry the day, then the virtuous must enforce their will on the Senate. The way of virtue is about actions, not words, says Haravgi, or, in the case of his proposal, actions not taken. To that end, Haravgi has asked each assembly of virtue to consider the following mandate. Despise those who take without giving. The Imperial Senate taxes our prosperity, but it may not tax our virtue. We send, named priest, with 25 doses of liao to persuade the faithful to withdraw their labour until the Senate ensures that all fines become the property of the Virtue Fund. Synod mandate, any virtue assembly. Each virtue assembly that passes this judgment will be able to influence members of the faithful across the Empire, encouraging them to refuse to support the Imperial Senate. If that happens, then the Imperial Senate will have one less commission slot for each virtue assembly, including the Assembly of the Way, that enacts this mandate. Golden Windfalls. The presence of the Golden Cascade has boosted the production of farms and herb gardens across Zenith. Dialgolos has proposed the virtuous citizens of the territory to share this windfall to serve the nation's interests. Now that the Golden Cascade is complete, it is providing invaluable support to farms and herb gardens across Zenith, boosting the prosperity of everyone in the territory. However, Cassia Silkweaver's statement has reminded everyone of the requirement to remain virtuous and remember that all is worthwhile that is shared with those who deserve it. Countless Urizen citizens have benefited from the Golden Cascade, but precious few of them attend Anvil, making it harder for them to share their prosperity with those who deserve it. Dialgolos has a proposal for this too. In this case, though, he thinks that there is an opportunity for Urizen to benefit from its newfound prosperity. The aging architect is familiar with the arguments of virtue, but he is more comfortable with more prosaic matters, like economics and diplomacy. Dialgolos points out that Urizen has benefited from friendship and support of Varushka, and further argues that such support is essential for the nation to thrive. His view of the Empire is a somewhat stark idea of a family of 10 siblings, each arguing over who will get what from the family estate. In Dialgolos's mind, the way for Urizen to grow stronger as a nation is not through words of gratitude but gestures of thanks. After all, loyalty is not displayed by words or deeds alone. To that end, Dialgolos has spent some considerable time corresponding with scores of citizens across Zenith who own a farm or garden that has benefited from the Golden Cascade. In each case, he has asked them to consider if they would put aside permanently a small portion of that prosperity to benefit the nation. Inspired by Cassia's statements, the architect proposes a way to create a bounty that could be used not just to thank the boyars of Varushka, but proactively in the future. His goal is to create someone who is specifically chosen by the Urizen Assembly with a remit to find citizens in other nations and help them. thereby creating friends and allies of Urizen across the Empire. Such a position would need offices from which to operate, somewhere where the various contributions could be gathered and collected. By good fortune, that just happens to fit with Dialgolos's proposal for a counting house in Zenith. If that house were made just a little bigger, then it could also serve as the offices for Dialgolos's proposed imperial title, the beneficiary of the Golden Cascade. It would require the counting house to be built with 8 wains of white granite and 8 wains of weirwood, and would cost 48 crowns, but it would still only require a month to complete. The beneficiary would need to be a national appointment by the Urizen National Assembly, and it would need to have very clear responsibilities: to use the harvest of the Golden Cascade to create friends and allies in other nations by seeking out opportunities to help and reward them for the aid they have or might give Urizen in the future. The idea is that they will give herbs and potions to any imperial citizen who could benefit from them, and thereby improve the nation's standing in the Empire. If that happens, and only if that happens, then the position will gain a windfall of herbs and potions each season, a share of prosperity provided by the Golden Cascade. If the title does not explicitly include the responsibilities that Dialgolos has proposed, then it won't get the wider support and will only get half of the listed benefits. High benefits. Virtuous citizens in Rykos would also be willing to share their windfall from the gardens of Chalcis to serve the nation's interests. Dialgolos's suggestion for creating a virtuous position funded by the beneficiaries of the Golden Cascade finds a receptive audience outside of Urizen. The benefactors of Highguard have long been committed to the idea of using wealth to invest in projects for the good of the nation and the Empire. The idea of creating a new imperial title and endowing it with a bounty of herbs appeals, and is particularly appealing to those who have benefited from the gardens of High Chalcis. In 381 YE, the Imperial Senate took the decision to direct the benefits of the gardens to support the Great Forest Orcs for a year, providing them with more than enough herbs for their needs. That act has not been repeated since, but the memory of it lingers in the minds of many. What if the bounty of these gardens were needed again in the future? Creating a formal arrangement for people to share some of the bounty with an imperial title, given the responsibility to use the herbs for the good of Highguard, would enable the nation to invest in their future. But it would also remind everyone of the past success with the Great Forest Orcs. That way, if the opportunity presented arose for the gardens to act in the same way in the future, it would be easier to accomplish. Jemima of Chalcis Ford suggests that the proposed counting houses might be the best way to achieve this. If Highguard built a slightly larger counting house in Rykos, it could be constructed next to the gardens of High Chalcis. If it were made a little bigger than originally planned, Jemima proposes to make it 7 wains of white granite, 7 wains of weirwood, and 42 crowns, then it could be large enough to house the offices of the new imperial title, the Benefactor of High Chalcis. If the benefactor were given the responsibility to use the bounty of the gardens to heal the virtuous throughout the Empire, then the people of Rykos would support the title with a bounty of herbs, 7 each of True Vervain, Cerulean Mazarine, Imperial Roseweald, Marrowwort, and Bladeroot. As Jemima sees it, the role of the apothecary is not just to treat the sick, but to make them healthier and stronger. If the Highborn National Assembly chose the right candidate, they can be charged to use the herbs they are given to seek out the deserving and the virtuous. By healing them, by strengthening the parts of the Empire that are committed to the way, the benefactor can help the Empire thrive and become more virtuous. It is an ambitious agenda to use the bounty of High Chalcis to promote virtue, but what higher purpose could there be? Jemima also suggests that the title be given legal authority over the gardens, so that if another crisis like the ones with the Great Forest Orcs ever arose again, then the benefactor would be in the position to respond to it quickly. Their proposal would give the benefactor the power to use a Senate announcement to redirect the output of the gardens to address a direct need identified in a civil service briefing, as happened the last time with the Great Forest Orcs. If the benefactor chose to do that, then neither the benefactor nor the herb gardens of Rykos would gain any benefit from the garden for as long as the redirection were in place. Allowing the benefactor of High Chalcis to redirect the bounty of gardens in this way would mean that no senator would have to give up their Senate motion to achieve the outcome. It would also place the ability to redirect the benefits of the gardens more directly in the power of those who benefit from the gardens. Of course, no such opportunity might ever present itself. It would not be possible to redirect the bounty of the gardens unless a specific opportunity did arise that explicitly stated that the bounty of the gardens could help the situation. But making these changes now would mean that Rykos was prepared to act, and act quickly, in that case. Small monuments. A monument has been proposed in Midwold to Jonathan Piper of Coxcroft. The proposal has led to a wider discussion about the creation of monuments in the Empire. During the autumn equinox, any number of statements of principle have been mooted calling for citizens to be rewarded. One, however, catches particular attention. Jonathan Piper of Coxcroft warned the marchers of the imminent threat from Siaka. Supported by the rest of the Marcher Assembly, their words were heard loud and clear, and when heralds of the Mother of Rex started causing trouble in Mittwold, people were prepared for it. Forward thinking like that, say some of the Mittwolders, deserves a bit of recognition. Even if, as a Coxcroft, Jonathan is an upholder. Even a daft rooster can call out sunrise and sunset, as one cruel Marcher aphorism has it. Obviously, anyone can slap a statue up and call it a day, but for it to have any cultural impact, then it needs to be commissioned. There's a whole bunch of folks who do things that are worth remembering, that might inspire people in years to come, but aren't about being recognised as a paragon or exemplar. Not just people either, there's lots of things you might build a monument for. A couple of Mittwolders who might have lost family to Siaka have found a nice spot at the old Wayford Wanderers practice ground. A sculptor would need to be found, and a block of white granite, but with a bit of ambition, those should be surmountable tasks. Then someone could make a statue of the Coxcroft lad, and at the same time maybe remember the Wayford Wanderers and the 30 or so folks who got eaten by the Shark Heralds. A nice statue that, should the Coxcroft lad keep on the same path, would make a good place to consecrate with True Liao one day, maybe. What's being proposed is a folly. It would require 5 wains of white granite and 15 crowns in labour costs to get the statue in position. Whoever raised the commission could name a specific sculptor to immortalise Jonathan Coxcroft and the attack of Siaka. If that sculptor was a player character, they would be able to submit up to 50 words describing the statue they created that would inform the description added to the wiki on the Mittwold territory page. There's another possibility as well, partly inspired by all this talk of rewarding and recognising people, partly by the recent statements of the Pride Assembly. The Senate could create an imperial title, the Mistress of Monuments perhaps, whose specific responsibility would be finding folks who deserve a statue, or events that deserve a monument, and building something. Nothing massive. Pride in small things after all, but the kind of thing the Senate doesn't have time for, what with all the castles and colleges of magic it needs to construct. The title would be limited to creating follies, and limited to spending a maximum of 9 wains on any given commission. It would be appointed through the Imperial Synod. The Assembly of the Way might be a good choice, but the General Assembly or any of the other virtue assemblies would be appropriate, and it would be responsible for recognising people who can provide an inspiration or events that might not ought to be forgotten. It could have tenure if the Senate wished, or it could be elected each year as detailed in the motion which creates it. When the proposal is mooted to the Constitutional Court, someone traps Leonatus the scribe against the buffet table at a wedding for nearly an hour. They are of the opinion that a title could be created, and as long as its responsibility was finding sculptors, paying some labourers to put the statue in position, and then telling people about it, it wouldn't count against the Senate's limited number of commissions each season. Indeed, the Senate might wish to give them a small stipend, even a few thrones each season, with which to acquire materials, pay artists, and employ burly folk with their own wheelbarrows. Out of character note, the title proposed would in theory be able to build any folly that used 9 wains or fewer. These kinds of follies are not going to change the face of the Empire. They'd be added to existing pages with a few lines of description at most, the nature of which would be guided by the sculptor and the title holder's announcement. There is nothing legally to stop the title holder commissioning a folly that isn't a statue or monument, but the expectation is that if they did so, the Synod would step in to remind them of their responsibilities, or the Senate might simply abrogate the title. It is also worth noting that the title as designed does not have the power of concedence, and so wouldn't be able to give anything away. Out of character design notes. We've made a small game update so that all the fines that arise from magistrates' trials at Anvil will now be collected and passed to the Imperial Treasury. We've looked at a few options on how best to dispose of the funds in recent times, and after some trial and error, we've decided that this is the best outcome. This way, the money circulates back into the game, but hopefully in a way that ensures it doesn't quickly end up back in the pockets of those who paid it. Having opted to move it to the Senate, that clearly puts the funds cleanly and clearly within the remit of players to decide on what happens to them next, within the normal limits of the checks and balances provided by the Constitution for game balance. So we created this little wind of fortune partly to advertise the fact that this is another option for players to politic over. Eli stood patiently while the ageing magistrate hung up his new painting. There were pictures going up all over the Castle of Thorns depicting the new Empress, so naturally the contrarian had paid an artist to paint one of the previous Empress. It was a rather dour impression, done in the highborn style, which in this case meant the Imperatrix had a deeply improbable halo of light issuing forth in an otherwise miserably dark canvas. Flattering, it was not. Good, isn't it? the old man asked over his shoulder. Eli was far too experienced to answer that question. I've come about the inquiry about taxation, Magistrate. The one from Haravki of Urizen. Best throne we've ever had, you know. Brilliant mind, quite brilliant. The old man made an attempt to stand his ground, but when Eli refused to be drawn, he admitted defeat. He turned to face the civil servant with a dour look on his face. I thought I said to ignore it and hope that he went away. Yes, I definitely said that, he continued, nodding to himself. I said to tell him to ask when he gets to Anvil. I'm afraid he's not planning to attend Anvil, Magistrate, and he's sent 2 more letters since then. We'll have to let him know if it's constitutional or not. Bloody Urizeni troublemaker. Of course it's not bloody constitutional. You pass that money to the Synod and it's taxation. Querulous Magistrate was looking very agitated now. I can tell him that easily enough, Magistrate, suggested Eli. What? You'd have us all murdered in our beds, I suppose? I think not. The old man fixed him with a stare, as if attempting to prove this ridiculous non sequitur made sense by glaring. Eli ensured his sigh was inaudible, and waited. I had a great career ahead of me in Harnmark, he thought to himself. If it's not constitutional for the Synod to have it, then the Senate can't have it either, can they? And if that's not constitutional, then the entire basis for punishment under imperial law is unconstitutional. Does that sound like a good outcome to you? Right, so clearly that can't be the answer either. The old man slumped in his chair. He pulled out a slim purple volume from his robes and began to flick through the well-thumbed pages. Tell him it's fine. That's all this bloody questor cares about, he said at last. We'll work out why it's a fine later. Thank you, Magistrate, said Eli, closing the door behind him as he smoothly exited the room.